My dad and I had never been close. Growing up, our relationship was a constant tug-of-war, a mix of unspoken expectations and quiet disappointments. He was the kind of man who believed that a job well done was the only measure of a person's worth and that emotions were best left unspoken. I, on the other hand, wore my feelings on my sleeve, always craving a connection I never quite got from him. It wasn't that he didn't care. At least, I don't think it was. He just had a way of showing his love that felt more like a test. Good grades, a clean room, and following the rules were his love language. If I slipped up, even in small ways, it felt like the ground beneath me shifted. He wouldn't yell, not often, but his quiet disappointment cut deeper than any words could. By the time I turned 18, I couldn't wait to leave. College was my escape, and I threw myself into it with everything I had. The distance between us, both physical and emotional, felt like a relief. I still called home out of obligation, but those calls were mostly for my mom. Conversations with Dad were brief, usually starting and ending with, "How's work?" and "Take care." As the years went on, the calls grew less frequent. By the time I was 26, we barely spoke at all. It was a Saturday morning when everything changed. I was sitting on the couch in my apartment, scrolling through my phone and sipping coffee, when my mom's name popped up on the screen. I frowned. She usually texted before calling, and we hadn't spoken in a few weeks. "Hey, Mom," I said, answering the call. "Elliot," she said, her voice trembling. "It's your dad." My stomach dropped. "What happened?" "He's in the hospital," she said quickly. "It's his heart. They think it was a mild heart attack." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The word heart attack hung in the air, heavy and unreal. My dad, the man who used to lift heavy boxes like they were nothing, who spent hours working on projects around the house, who never seemed to get sick. "I'm coming home," I said finally. "You don't have to." "Mom," I interrupted, my voice firm. "I'm coming." The flight home felt like it lasted an eternity. I kept replaying everything my mom had said on the phone, trying to piece together the details she'd given me. Mild heart attack, stable condition, tests still ongoing. But the words didn't add up in my head. My dad wasn't supposed to be the kind of man who ended up in a hospital bed. By the time I landed and made my way to the hospital, it was late in the afternoon. My mom was waiting for me in the lobby, her face pale and drawn. She looked older than I remembered, and it hit me that it had been almost a year since I'd last seen her in person. "Elliot," she said, pulling me into a hug. "How is he?" I asked, pulling back to look at her. "He's stable," she said, her voice shaky. "They're still running tests, but the doctor said it wasn't as bad as it could have been." I nodded, relief and anxiety warring inside me. "Can I see him?" She hesitated, glancing toward the hallway that led to his room. "He's awake, but just be prepared. He's not himself right now." Walking into his hospital room felt surreal. My dad, the man who had always seemed larger than life, was lying in bed, surrounded by tubes and monitors. His face was pale, his usually sharp eyes dulled by exhaustion. For the first time in my life, he looked fragile. "Hey," I said awkwardly, standing just inside the doorway. He turned his head slowly, his gaze landing on me. "Elliot," he said, his voice raspier than I'd ever heard it. "You're here." "Of course I'm here," I said, stepping closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" He gave a small shrug, wincing slightly at the movement, like someone took a hammer to my chest. The attempt at humor fell flat, and we both lapsed into silence. I wasn't sure what to say, and he didn't seem in the mood to fill the void. Over the next few days, I split my time between the hospital and my parents' house. Staying in my childhood bedroom felt strange, like stepping into a version of myself I'd left behind long ago. The posters on the walls, the stacks of old books on the shelves, even the bedspread, all of it felt frozen in time, a reminder of who I used to be. My mom did her best to keep things running smoothly, but I could tell she was struggling. She tried to stay upbeat, but there were moments when I caught her staring off into the distance, worry etched into her face. "Have you eaten anything today?" I asked her one afternoon as we sat in the kitchen. She waved me off. "I'm fine." Don't worry about me. Mom, I said, my tone firm. You need to take care of yourself too. She sighed, giving me a tired smile. You're just like him, you know. I blinked. What? Your dad, she said. Always worrying about everyone else but himself. I didn't know how to respond to that. The next time I visited my dad, it was just the two of us. My mom had gone home to rest, leaving me alone with him for the first time since I'd arrived. He was sitting up in bed, his eyes closed, when I walked in. Hey, I said, pulling up a chair beside him. He opened his eyes, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. You didn't have to come all the way here, you know, he said gruffly. You're my dad, I said simply. Of course I came. He didn't say anything for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the wall. Finally he sighed. I guess I haven't made that easy for you, have I? The question caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure how to respond. What do you mean? He shook his head, a faint, self-deprecating smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Nothing. Forget it. But I couldn't forget it. His words stayed with me long after I left the room, stirring up questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. For the first time in years, I found myself stuck in the same space as my dad, forced to confront not just him, but the weight of everything left unsaid between us. The hospital room, the machines beeping steadily, and his weakened state all felt foreign. This wasn't the man I grew up fearing and idolizing in equal measure. He looked smaller, as if his body couldn't carry the burden of his usual presence anymore. After he made that strange comment about not making things easy for me, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't like him to admit anything remotely self-reflective. My dad had always been a wall, stoic, unyielding, and more likely to give a silent glance of approval than say, I'm proud of you. That single sentence cracked the wall, just a little. And the crack was all I could think about as I sat in the house where I grew up, surrounded by memories of our fractured relationship. The next day, my mom and I went back to the hospital. She carried a bag of clothes and snacks for him, a sort of care package that spoke to how much she loved him, even when he was difficult. My mom had always been the bridge between us. When I was younger, she would soften my dad's harsh words, help me decode his gruff tone, and remind me that deep down he cared. But it was hard to believe that when I was a kid trying to earn his approval. On the drive, I asked her a question that had been circling in my head. Was Dad always like this? You know, before I was born. She hesitated, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. Your dad has always been tough, she said finally. But he wasn't as hard when we first got married. He used to laugh more, used to joke around. I turned to look at her, surprised. It was hard to imagine him like that. What changed? I asked. She sighed. Life, I guess. Work. Providing for a family. He wanted to give us everything he didn't have growing up, and somewhere along the way, I think he forgot how to be soft. I didn't know what to say to that, so I stayed quiet. When we arrived at the hospital, my dad was sitting up in bed, flipping through a newspaper. He looked better than he had the day before, still tired, but less pale, and with a little more energy in his voice. Hey, Dad, I said, standing by the door while my mom moved around the room, unpacking the bag she'd brought. He glanced at me and nodded. Elliot, you're here again. Figured you could use the company, I said, pulling up a chair. He grunted, a noncommittal sound that could have meant anything. But he didn't ask me to leave, so I stayed. The three of us sat together for a while, talking about nothing in particular. My mom filled the silence with updates about the neighbors, the weather, and other bits of small-town gossip. My dad chimed in occasionally, though his responses were mostly curt. At one point, my mom excused herself to grab coffee, leaving me alone with him again. The silence that followed was heavy, but this time, I felt like I needed to say something. You scared us, I said finally. He raised an eyebrow, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. Scared you? Yeah, I said. When Mom called and said you were in the hospital. I don't know. I guess I always thought you were invincible. He let out a dry chuckle. Not quite. For a moment, I thought that was the end of the conversation. But then he surprised me by saying, I didn't think it was a big deal at first. Just some chest pain. Figured I'd tough it out. Why didn't you say anything sooner? I asked, my frustration slipping through. He shrugged. Didn't want to make a fuss. Dad, it's not a fuss if it's your heart, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. You could have, I trailed off, unable to say the words. He looked at me, his expression softening just slightly. I'm still here, Elliot. I nodded, but the thought of how close we'd come to losing him stayed with me. Later that evening, after we'd returned home, I found myself sitting in the living room with my mom. She was folding laundry, her movements slow and deliberate, like her mind was elsewhere. Do you think he's going to change? I asked suddenly. She looked up, startled. What do you mean? I mean, do you think this is going to make him different? Less. I don't know. Less like himself. She set down the shirt she was folding and gave me a long, thoughtful look. I think people can change, but only if they want to. Your dad is stubborn, but he's not immune to fear. This scared him, Elliot. And sometimes fear is what it takes to make someone reevaluate their life. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. My dad was the most stubborn person I'd ever met. The idea of him reflecting on his choices felt almost impossible. The next day, I went to visit him on my own. My mom needed a break, so I volunteered to sit with him while she ran errands. When I walked into the room, he was staring out the window, his face unreadable. Hey, I said, setting my bag down on the chair. Hey, he replied, not turning around. I sat down and waited for him to say something, but he stayed quiet. After a while, I decided to speak up. Mom told me you used to laugh more, I said, my voice casual. That got his attention. He turned to look at me, one eyebrow raised. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said quickly. I just mean she said you used to be different. Before, he sighed, leaning back against the pillows. I guess I was, he admitted. But things change when you have responsibilities. When people are counting on you. I know, I said. But I don't think we ever expected you to be perfect, Dad. We just wanted you to be present. He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. I thought I was, he said quietly. The sadness in his voice caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. As I left the hospital that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen a side of my dad I'd never seen before. Vulnerable, reflective, human. It wasn't an easy realization, but it gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, things between us could start to change. The following week felt like stepping into uncharted territory. My dad's recovery was steady, but the unspoken tension between us lingered, as if we were circling around something neither of us knew how to address. He was discharged from the hospital on a rainy Tuesday morning. I drove him home, while my mom followed behind in her car. The rain pattered against the windshield, and the silence in the car was only broken by the faint hum of the radio. You're driving too slow, he said after a while, his voice gruff, but lacking its usual edge. You just had a heart attack, I replied dryly, my eyes fixed on the road. Forgive me for not speeding. To my surprise, he chuckled a low, almost reluctant sound. Fair enough. When we got home, my mom fussed over him, insisting he sit down and rest while she made tea. He protested, of course, saying he didn't need to be coddled, but there was no fight in his voice. He looked exhausted, and I could see the way he sank into the recliner, his usual rigid posture giving way to something more fragile. I sat across from him, watching as he stared at the blank TV screen. It was strange seeing him like this, quiet, subdued, almost unsure of himself. You good? I asked after a while. He nodded without looking at me. Just tired. The conversation died there, but something about the way he avoided my gaze made me wonder if there was more he wasn't saying. The next few days followed a predictable rhythm. I stayed at my parents' house, helping out where I could, though my dad didn't seem to like the idea of me hanging around. You've got your own life to get back to, he said one morning as I helped him out to the backyard. I can spare a few days, I replied, keeping my tone light. He grumbled something under his breath, but didn't argue further. We sat on the patio for a while, the early spring air crisp and cool. My dad had always loved the backyard. He'd spent years building it into his personal sanctuary, complete with a vegetable garden, a small koi pond, and a sturdy wooden bench he'd made himself. I remembered watching him work on that bench when I was a kid, his hands steady and precise as he sanded the wood. I'd wanted to help, but he told me to stay back, afraid I'd hurt myself with the tools. At the time, I thought he didn't want me around. Now, sitting beside him on the same bench, I wondered if I'd been wrong. "You remember when you built this?" I asked, running my hand along the smooth wood. He glanced at the bench, then at me. "Of course I do. Took me weeks to get it right." "You wouldn't let me help," I said, the words coming out softer than I'd intended. His brow furrowed slightly, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the garden. "I didn't want you to get hurt," he said after a pause. "I know," I said, "but at the time, I thought you just didn't want me around." He let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. "That wasn't it," he said. I didn't know how to explain things to you back then. I figured it was easier to do it myself." His honesty caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure how to respond. So I didn't. We sat there in silence, the sound of birds chirping in the distance filling the space between us. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, my mom brought out a photo album. She was always doing that, pulling out old pictures whenever the three of us were together, as if nostalgia could mend the gaps in our family. "Look at this one," she said, sliding a photo across the table. It was a picture of my dad and me, taken when I was about 7 years old. We were standing in the backyard, my hands covered in dirt from the garden, while he stood behind me with his arms crossed and a rare smile on his face. "I forgot about this," I said, staring at the photo. "You two spent the whole afternoon out there," my mom said, smiling. "Elliot kept asking you a million questions about the plants, and you actually answered them all." My dad let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "He wouldn't stop talking," he said, but there was no malice in his tone. "I don't remember that," I admitted. "Well, I do," my mom said firmly. "You two had more good moments than you think." Her words stayed with me long after dinner. Maybe she was right. Maybe I'd spent so much time focusing on the ways my dad and I had clashed that I'd forgotten about the moments when we'd gotten along. The problem was, those moments felt so few and far between that it was hard to believe they mattered. The next morning, I found my dad in the garage, tinkering with an old radio he'd been meaning to fix for years. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Trying to make myself useful," he said without looking up. "You're supposed to be resting," he grunted, setting the screwdriver down and wiping his hands on a rag. "Resting's boring." I hesitated before stepping inside. "Need a hand?" He looked at me, surprised. "You know how to fix a radio?" "Not really," I admitted. "But I can hold things." He chuckled, a rare sound that eased some of the tension between us. "All right then," he said, gesturing for me to sit down. For the next hour, we worked together in companionable silence. He explained what he was doing as he went, his tone calm and patient in a way I hadn't experienced from him in years. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. By the time I left the garage, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a small flicker of hope. Maybe we'd never have the kind of relationship I used to dream about as a kid. Maybe he'd never be the kind of dad who said, "I love you," or gave heartfelt speeches about how proud he was of me. But maybe we didn't need to be. Maybe these quiet moments of understanding, was enough. Over the next few days, the tension between my dad and me seemed to soften. It wasn't as though we were suddenly best friends, or that years of distance and unspoken words had magically disappeared, but something had shifted. The air felt a little lighter, and the silences weren't as heavy as they used to be. The garage became a neutral ground for us. Every morning, I'd find him tinkering with some project, fixing old tools, organizing shelves, or trying to bring something broken back to life. It was a space where he felt comfortable, where the weight of his recovery and the awkwardness of our relationship seemed to fade. I started joining him more often, even if it was just to sit and listen while he explained what he was working on. It reminded me of when I was a kid, trailing behind him and peppering him with questions about how things worked. Back then, I'd felt like he was a puzzle I couldn't solve, equal parts intimidating and fascinating. Now, as an adult, I realized he probably felt the same way about me. One afternoon, as we were sorting through a box of old tools, he broke the silence. "You know," he said, holding up a rusted wrench, "this was the first tool I ever bought. Got it at a hardware store when I was about your age." I raised an eyebrow. "You kept it all these years?" He shrugged, turning the wrench over in his hands. "It was the only one I could afford back then. I didn't have much money, but I needed it for work. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away." I nodded, unsure of what to say. It was rare for him to talk about his younger years, and I didn't want to interrupt. He set the wrench down and leaned back against the workbench. "You know, when I was growing up, we didn't have much. My dad was a good man, but he wasn't around much. Always working, trying to keep food on the table. I guess I learned a lot from him, but not the things I should have." The admission caught me off guard. My dad rarely spoke about his own father, and when he did, it was usually in passing. "I always told myself I'd be different," he continued, "that I'd be more present, but then life got in the way. And well, I guess I became more like him than I wanted to admit." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to reassure him, to tell him he hadn't failed completely. But another part of me felt the weight of his words, the truth behind them. That evening, I found myself sitting in my old bedroom, staring at the walls that were still covered in posters and photos from my teenage years. My mom knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. "Everything okay?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Yeah," I said, though my mind was still spinning from the conversation with my dad. "I think so." She gave me a knowing look. "You and your dad have been spending a lot of time in the garage lately." "Yeah," I said again. "It's different. I don't know how to describe it. You two are more alike than you think," she said, smiling gently. "He just doesn't always know how to show it." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's not easy, though. Sometimes I feel like we're making progress. And then I remember all the years we barely spoke. All the times he made me feel like I wasn't enough." My mom's expression softened, and she reached out to place a hand on mine. "Your dad has his flaws, Elliot. I won't pretend he doesn't. But I know he loves you, even if he's not good at saying it. And I think he's trying, in his own way." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. The next day, my dad surprised me. As I walked into the garage, I noticed an old wooden box sitting on the workbench. He was standing next to it, his arms crossed, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "What's this?" I asked, pointing to the box. He hesitated before opening the lid, revealing a collection of worn notebooks and yellowed papers. "Your grandpa's journals," he said. "I found them after he passed. Never got around to reading them until recently." I blinked, caught off guard. "You've had these this whole time?" He nodded. "I didn't think much of them back then. But after the hospital, I started going through them. Turns out, he wrote a lot about his regrets, about the things he wished he'd done differently." I picked up one of the notebooks, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was neat but shaky in places, the words filling the pages with stories and reflections. "He wasn't perfect," my dad said quietly, "but he did the best he could with what he had." And reading these made me realize I've been doing the same thing. I looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. For so long, I'd seen my dad as someone who was unwilling to change, someone stuck in his ways. But standing there, watching him open up about his own struggles and insecurities, I realized he was just as human as I was. That night, I sat in my room with one of the journals, reading through my grandfather's words. He wrote about his childhood, his dreams, and the ways life had forced him to make sacrifices. He wrote about my dad, too, about how proud he was of him, even if he didn't always show it. It made me wonder if my dad felt the same way about me. I didn't know for sure, but for the first time in a long time, I wanted to believe he did. The days that followed were quieter, but there was a sense of understanding between us that hadn't been there before. We didn't talk about the journals again, but I noticed small changes in my dad. He asked me more questions, listened more when I talked, and even made a point to thank me when I helped out around the house. They were small gestures, but they meant everything. For years, I thought our relationship was beyond repair. But now, sitting with him in the garage, sharing stories and quiet moments, I realized that maybe we didn't need to fix everything. Maybe it was enough to just start fresh. The day I packed my bags to return home, the air in my parents' house felt different. It wasn't heavy like it had been when I first arrived. It was quieter, but in a way that felt like healing instead of tension. I found my dad in the garage, tinkering with the same old radio he'd been working on all week. He didn't look up when I stepped inside, but I knew he'd heard me. "Leaving already?" he asked after a moment, his voice neutral, but tinged with something else. Maybe regret. "Yeah," I said, leaning against the workbench. Figured it was time to get back to my own mess. He nodded, setting down a screwdriver and wiping his hands on a rag. "Your mom's going to miss having you around." "And you?" I asked, half joking, but the words came out more serious than I intended. He paused, then gave me a rare, faint smile. "Yeah, me too." I wasn't expecting the lump in my throat at his words, but it was there all the same. We weren't the kind of family to say, "I love you" outright, but those 3 words were hidden in the moments like this, in the things left unsaid. "Thanks for letting me stick around," I said. "You didn't need my permission," he replied, his tone soft. "But it was good having you here." The words hit harder than I thought they would, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Before I left, my mom insisted on taking one last family photo. She set up her old camera on a tripod in the living room, fussing over the angle and lighting while my dad and I stood awkwardly on either side of the couch. "Okay, on 3, she said, hurrying to join us. 1, 2. Before she could say 3, my dad cracked a small, almost reluctant grin. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the moment feel real. The camera clicked, freezing the moment in time. The drive back to my apartment was quiet, the countryside rolling by as I thought about everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks. My dad and I hadn't fixed everything. Not even close. There were still years of distance between us, wounds that would take time to heal, and questions we might never answer. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a chance. A week later, a package arrived at my door. It was small and battered, the handwriting on the front unmistakably my dad's. Inside was the old wrench he'd shown me in the garage, along with a note written in his neat, blocky script. "Thought you might need this someday. Love, Dad." I stared at the note for a long time, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. It wasn't much, just a wrench and a few words scrawled on paper, but it was more than I ever thought I'd get from him, and it was enough. Over the following months, I called home more often. The conversations with my dad were still short and sometimes awkward, but there was a warmth to them now that hadn't been there before. We were learning, slowly but surely, how to be in each other's lives again. It wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But as I worked on rebuilding the relationship with him, I realized something important. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about finding a way forward. One night, as I sat at my desk, I pulled out my grandfather's journals and flipped through the pages. His words felt like echoes of my dad's struggles and my own, a reminder that none of us were perfect, but we didn't have to be. We just had to try. And for the first time, I felt like we were both finally doing that.